The Sister Giant Conference, hosted and moderated by Marianne Williamson, was held in Los Angeles, California on March 28 and 29, 2015. Many speakers, including former Congressman Dennis Kucinich, Thom Hartmann, Senator Bernie Sanders, gave talk and participated in the conference. Global Voices for Justice media organization recorded the entire event and is bringing you the following 10 programs from beginning to end. I am Mansour Saba.
We are so fortunate to have him here tonight. Please join with me in giving the warmest Los Angeles welcome to Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you. See, after being called a genius by Marianne, after being compared to Lily's outstanding performance, I am already a nervous wreck. I cannot live up to these expectations. No way. But let me thank all of you for being here. Let me thank Marianne not only for helping to organize this conference, but for all of the extraordinary work she has done for so many years through her writings and through her focusing, in fact, on all of the major issues facing our country and the world, and in getting people involved in the political process. Marianne, thank you so much for all that you do. I am also delighted to be here with dear friends, people I've known for a very long time. Thom Hartmann and I, as you may know, do a radio show almost every Friday. We didn't do it today, but we do it, we didn't do it yesterday, but we do it and have done it for about 8 or 9 years. And at a time when 95 or 96% of talk radio is dominated by right-wing extremists, Thom has been out there year after year giving people an alternative vision. Thom, thank you. And I am also delighted to be here with somebody who I've known for probably well over 30 years, and that is Dennis Kucinich. Way back when Dennis and I were a little bit younger, he was the mayor of Cleveland, I was the mayor of Burlington, and we started causing trouble way back then, and we've been doing it since. And Dennis clearly is one of the courageous political figures of our time, and we thank him for all that he has done. All right, what I want to do this evening is do something that is not often done by political figures, and that is actually talk about the real issues facing the American people. And I know that's a radical, unconventional idea, but what the hell? I'm in L.A. Let's go for it, right? The first point that I want to make may seem to be an obvious point, but it's not. And that is the problems facing our country are clearly very, very serious, and we'll talk about them this evening. And by the way, when I'm finished, we'll open it up for questions and comments. But the first point that I want to make is that the problems that we face were caused by human decisions, bad human decisions. God didn't create these problems. There was not a tornado or a hurricane, a flood that caused these problems. They were caused by bad decisions. And we have got to have the confidence to believe that if we get our act together, good human decisions can, in fact, address these problems. Yes. In other words, and Thom and I often talk about this on the radio, despair is not an option. Yes. It is not good enough for you to say, as I'm sure Marianne has heard throughout her life, and I have heard, and Dennis has heard, I'm burnt out. Man, I was on a demonstration to reverse climate change. It didn't happen. I'm giving up. And we have heard that time and time again. And I think as Marianne and Lily pointed out, we know that the issues we're talking about today, the struggles that we are talking about today, have not gone on for decades. In a sense, have not gone on for hundreds of years. They have gone on for thousands of years. The struggle for human dignity is a recurring struggle over and over again. And we should be very proud that in the last 40 or 50 years, this country has made a lot of progress in certain areas. In the midst of a very awful political and economic situation, let's not understate the success that we have had because of the struggle of millions of people in creating a much less discriminatory society. All right? You get depressed about politics today. If we were in this room 30 or 40 years ago and somebody stood up and said, you know what, I think this country is mature enough so that by the year 2008 we'll elect an African American to be president and re-elect him 4 years later, people would have told him he was crazy. I would have said that person is crazy. It happened because millions of people for decades stood together and said racism is not acceptable. And clearly, we all know we still have a very long way to go, but don't underestimate the success that mass action has had, the success of the struggle of so many people. Now, where we are today, in this moment in the year 2015, is very tough. We should not underestimate the problems that we face. And to my mind, and I don't use this phrase dramatically, for us to move forward, we need a political revolution in this country. Now, what do I mean? What do I mean by a political revolution? We need election reform and significantly increasing voter turnout. Yes. All right, now that may seem pretty simple. In this last election, where the Republicans did so well, 36% of the American people voted. 80% of low-income working people did not vote. 80% of young people did not vote. And I will absolutely guarantee you that we will not make change when 2/3 of the American people do not vote. Now, there are reasons why, often valid reasons why people are not voting, and we'll discuss it. But when you compare voter turnout here to many other countries, that will tell you why we are where we are today. What else do we need? Well, we need, very significantly, and I think Marianne has focused on this issue tonight, we need real campaign finance reform. As a result of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which will go down in history as one of the very worst Supreme Court decisions ever, that decision opened the door for billionaires to buy American democracy. Right now, the billionaire class controls a significant part of our economy, and Citizens United said, you own the economy, you now have an opportunity to own the United States government and state houses throughout this country, and the billionaire class is doing that right now. We have got to overturn Citizens United. We have got to move toward public funding of elections. When I talk about political revolution, I also mean something as simple as significantly increasing political consciousness in this country. Last year, there was a poll done, and the results didn't surprise me and shouldn't surprise you. Pollsters asked people, and this is a year ago, and they said, can you tell me which political party controls the U.S. House of Representatives and controls the U.S. Senate? And at that time, the Democrats controlled the Senate, Republicans controlled the House. 63% of the American people could not answer that question correctly. Most people do not know who their member of Congress is. So how do you make change in this country when people have a very little understanding of what is going on in Washington? And in my view, a lot of the reason for that lack of knowledge has to do with a corporately owned media which spends all of its time, it seems, converting politics into some kind of game show or football show rather than talking about the real issues facing our people and engaging us in a real discussion. Now, you may agree or disagree, and I think most of us probably disagree with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But you know what? The important issue is, to the best of my knowledge, network television has not said one word about the largest trade agreement in the history of the country. Now, how do you have a debate on that issue? I am, as Marianne mentioned, the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee. And I've been working on that issue for the last 2 weeks. And what I will tell you is what is a fact, not to be debated. Mitch McConnell were here, he wouldn't debate it. The Republican budget, among many other horrendous things, threw 27 million Americans off of health care. That's what happens when you end, as they voted to do, the Affordable Care Act, and you cut $440 billion from Medicaid. That's a fact. Now, that is disturbing. But you know what's even more disturbing? My guess is that none of you had seen that issue on television or read it in the papers. You might think that if the dominant party in Washington threw 27 million people off of health insurance, it might get a headline somewhere. But it didn't. About a year ago, some of us in the Senate, Brian Schatz of Hawaii and a few others and myself, we wrote a letter to the presidents of the major networks. In fact, I met with the president of CBS, and the letter basically said the following. It said, the scientific community, virtually unanimously, believes that climate change is the greatest environmental threat to our planet. And a study recently published shows that the major networks virtually dismissed and did not talk about climate change. And actually, after the letter was written, 2 Sundays later, all 3 of the networks talked about climate change. But here's the important point. On major issue after major issue, corporate media refuses to allow us to have a serious discussion. I don't care what your view may be, but when you live in a democracy, the people have a right to know what the hell is going on and how people feel about the important issues. So when I talk about a political revolution, in one way or another, and I'd love to hear your ideas, and that's why I applaud what Tom Houghton has done for years and others. We need a revolution in media, all right? What goes on in Washington is not a football game, and it is not a game show. The decisions being made impact every life in this room and every life in America. And the American people have a right to be engaged in that discussion, and the media has got to talk about those issues. Now, let me contrast for a moment what goes on in our country with what's going on in some other countries. And that's also something we don't talk enough about. You know, and I know, for example, that in the United States, we are the only major country on earth that doesn't guarantee health care to all people. You know it, and I know it, and we're ashamed of that fact. And many of us support a Medicare for all single-payer program. But you know it, and I know it, but you know what? Most of the people in this country don't know it. They think a system in which 35 million people have no health insurance is the norm. They think a system in which we pay the highest prices for prescription drugs in the world is the norm, because we have not had that discussion as to why we end up paying far more per capita for health care than any other country and get much less. We've got to demand the media allow us to have that discussion as well. Now, of all of the crises that we face, the most serious crisis is, in fact, that we don't discuss the serious crisis that we face. That's the issue. So my radical request of you, not of you, but of people throughout this country, and I'm not asking all that much, but maybe we would like to spend maybe a half, maybe a third as much time worrying about what's the life is going to face our kids and our grandchildren compared to March Madness and the NCAA finals. I'm not asking a lot, maybe a third. Essentially, when you look at politics, you get away from the media who thinks it's a ball game and polls and how much money you raise and all that stuff. What are you talking about? What you're talking about first is for honest people to come forward and say, all right, what are the problems? What are the problems facing this country? Now, when you go to the doctor and you're not feeling well, what you want the doctor to do is to diagnose your problems and come up with a therapy to make you better. Politics is not really different. What are the real issues facing the American people? That's what we need to determine, and I want to get into that a little bit. So let me start off by talking about the American economy today. In terms of economics, the simple and most important reality that we have got to deal with is that the great middle class of our country, which is once the envy of the entire world, has been disappearing for the last 40 years. The good news is that we are better off today than we were when Bush left office. That is true. But the bad news is that we are significantly worse off than we used to be. Now, when you read the papers or you watch TV, they tell you that unemployment is 5.5%. That's not true. Real unemployment, including those people who have given up looking for work and those people who are working part-time when they want to work full-time, is 11%. An issue that is never discussed is youth unemployment. You never hear discussion about youth unemployment. Youth unemployment in this country is 17%, and African American youth unemployment is much higher than that. So forget even trying to deal with those issues. The Congress and the media refuse to even acknowledge those issues. Today, millions of Americans are working longer hours for lower wages. 45 million Americans are now living in poverty, and poverty is also a word that we're not allowed to talk about very often. But we have more people living in poverty today than almost any time in the modern history of this country. In the United States today, at almost 20%, we have by far the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major nation on earth. And despite the modest successes of the Affordable Care Act, we still have 35 million Americans who have no health insurance, and you got a lot more than that, including people in this room who are underinsured, who have large copayments and high deductibles. There are a lot of angry people all across this country. Some of them identify themselves with the Tea Party and see themselves as conservatives. Some of them, including many of us in this room, see ourselves as progressives, identifying with the ideas of Occupy Wall Street. But picking up on what Marianne talked about a moment ago, and one of the themes of this conference, let me tell you why people are angry and why they have every right in the world to be angry. Despite a revolution in technology, now we take it for granted, When I was mayor of Burlington in the 1980s, it was a big deal when we got the first computer in City Hall. That was in the 1980s. So what we have seen in the last 30, 40 years is a revolution in technology, huge increase in worker productivity. So here's the good news. Every one of you is producing a lot more than somebody who had your job or a similar job 30 or 40 years ago. Given that reality, you might think one of two things. That if I am producing more, I am working fewer hours. You're laughing. Or if I am working the same amount of time, I am making a lot more money. Right? Wrong. I can remember this. When I was in college, they actually taught a course about the need for Americans to understand leisure. And the argument was that with all of the technology and robotics that were being developed, what would Americans do when they were working 20 or 30 hours a week? What would they do with all of their spare time? Well, today, with Americans working longer hours than almost any people in the world, when people in my state, and I'm sure here, are working 2, 3, 4 jobs to cobble together an income and some health care, they don't teach those courses anymore. They teach courses on stress management. And how couples can stay together when mom is working 50 hours and dad is working 60 hours, and what happens to the kid. Since 1999, when we talk about the economy and why people are angry, the median middle-class family has seen its income go down by almost $5,000 after adjusting for inflation. Incredibly, that family earned almost $500 less last year than it did 26 years ago, back in 1989. Got that? People are working incredible hours, working 2 jobs, they're working 3 jobs, and they're worse off as a family than they were in 1989. Listen to this. The male worker, the man right in the middle of the American economy, made $783 less last year than he did 42 years ago. You see these Tea Party guys ranting and raving out? They get angry at the wrong people for the wrong reasons. But the reason they are angry is they understand something wrong. They're working, everybody is working longer hours, and they're going nowhere in a hurry. Typical female workers earned $1,300 less last year than they did in 2005. And median family income, and the median family has seen its wealth go down by more than 36% since 2005. So what is all that about? It's people are anxious, they're scared, they're angry, they don't quite know why. But this is why. All over this country, it's not just that people are working so hard. People are worried about getting fired. They're worried about their job going to China. They're worried about a younger worker replacing them if they're 50 or 60. It's not only that. They are worried, maybe even more so, about what kind of life their kids will have. Will their kids be able to go to school without enormous debt? Will their kids have health care? Will their kids be able to have a decent job? There is enormous anxiety in this country, and those are the reasons why. And when you talk about people being anxious and people being scared, understand that half of all Americans have less than $10,000 in their savings accounts, and they have no idea as to how they're going to retire with dignity. People get old, you get sick. When you get old, you can't work and make an income, and you got no money in the bank. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my wife? People are extraordinarily anxious. Today, over 5.5 million young people have either dropped out of high school or graduated high school. And you know what they're doing? 5.5 million young people who graduated high school or dropped out of high school, those 5.5 million people are doing nothing. They're hanging out on street corners, and many of them are going to end up in jail, which is one of the reasons why we have more people in jail than any other country on earth. We have more people in jail than a communist authoritarian China, which has far more people than we have. Maybe, just maybe, we might want to invest in jobs and education for our young people rather than throw them in jail. Now, it's important for us to understand why the middle class is disappearing. And it's not, people write big books on it, but let me just try to summarize some of the reasons. When we talk about the decline of the middle class, it's important to understand that since 2001, we have lost in this country over 60,000 factories and millions of decent paying jobs. Now, the young people, literally, when they go shopping and they buy products made in China or Vietnam or wherever, they literally do not know that there was once a time, not so many decades ago, that in the United States we produced much of what we purchased. Corporations, multinational corporations, as a result of disastrous trade policies, and by that I mean NAFTA and CAFTA and permanent normal trade relations with China. And I'll never forget that, and Dennis will remember it as well, because we were in Congress at the time. You had the agenda of corporate America putting pressure on the president, putting pressure on the Congress, and their argument is, think of what happens, all of the products that we're going to be selling to Mexico, and later on all the products we're going to be selling to China. Nobody who had any sense believed it then, and certainly we don't believe it now. As a result of these disastrous trade policies, millions of American workers have been thrown out on the streets of America. If you want to know about the American economy and what's happened over the last 30 years, know this. 30 or so years ago, the largest private sector employer in the United States was General Motors. General Motors made a real product. It had a strong union, the UAW. It paid good wages. It had very good benefits. That was 30 years ago. Today, the largest private sector employer in America is Walmart, which pays starvation wages, is vehemently anti-union, and has almost no benefits at all. That is the transition of the American economy. In terms of education, now everybody here understands that we are in a highly competitive global economy, and we need to have the best educated workforce. But more importantly, we understand that education and learning and intellect and intellectual activity is what being human is about. It's an important part of what being human is about. And I would hope that every person in this room understands that it is imperative that every person in this country who has the desire and the ability gets the education they need regardless of the income of their family. Now, here's the sad news. Here is the sad news. Today, 30 years ago, we led the world in terms of the percentage of our people who graduated college. We were number 1. Today, we are number 12. And what that means is there are hundreds of thousands of bright, young people who have so much to offer, who look at the cost of college today, who look at the kind of debt they're going to leave school with, and they say, no thanks, it's not worth it. And then you got millions of other people who in fact do go to college, and they leave school or graduate school deeply in debt. And that debt hangs around their shoulders for decades. A few months ago, I met a woman who was not only paying off her debt from college, she was paying off her kids' debt from college. All right? It goes on and on. Now, what sense does it make in a competitive global economy to discourage and make it hard for people to get the education that they need? What we have got to do is instead of investing more in the military, what we have got to do is say tuition. And here's the irony about this whole thing. Here's the irony. In your great state of California, I don't know how many of you remember that, but 30, 40 years ago, what was the tuition at the University of California, one of the great universities? Well, it's an argument. It was either $200 or zero. But it was a hell of a lot less than it is today. The great City College of New York, one of the great colleges in America, tuition was zero. So where have we gone in 40 years? We've gone in exactly the wrong direction. I will be very shortly introducing legislation which will make tuition free for every public college and university in this country. Thank you. Now, I've talked a little bit of what's happening to the working class of this country, what's happening to the middle class of this country. And all of that would be understandable if, for example, some terrible tragedy befell America and everybody suffered. There was some terrible natural disaster. You know, there are tornadoes that strike a town and it leaves a path of pain and horror. But I think what makes the American people today so angry and so frustrated is that the economic crisis that they are experiencing is certainly not universal. The fact of the matter is that while tens of millions of American families are struggling to put bread on the table, while millions of families are one paycheck away from disaster. I mean, I have talked to people if their car broke down and they didn't get to work and they got fired from their job, their entire family would financially collapse. Talk to people who are one divorce away from disaster, one illness away from disaster, one automobile accident. People are just hanging on. And if one part of the picture ends up badly, they collapse. They lose their jobs, they lose their income, and God knows where they will be. But in the midst of that suffering and that anxiety, there is another reality in America that needs to be talked about a whole lot. And that is that our country today has, by far, not even close, the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major economy on earth. And that gap between the very, very rich and everyone else is growing wider. Now, I'm going to bore you for a moment with some statistics. My wife says, don't do it, don't do it. People are going to get bored, but the hell with it. I'm going to do it. But here you go. And you got all this stuff. If you fall asleep now, it's on my website, sanders.senate.gov. But I wanted to go through it. All right, here it is. Today in America, the top 1% owns about 42% of the financial wealth of America. Okay? 1% owns 42%. When I talk to kids, I say, look at that big pizza. It's 100 slices of pizza, and one pretty chubby guy gets 42 slices. But this is a very sophisticated audience, and I don't have to do that. And then, if you look at the pizza, you find that the bottom 60% own about 1.7% of the wealth. So you got less than two people. The bottom 60% owns less than 2%. Top 1% owns 42%. So you got two people. You got 60 people sharing 2% of the pizza. Two pieces of pizza. This pizza analogy is very bad. All right, forget the pizza story. All right. Now, here's something else, all right? Listen to this one. Forget the pizzas, but listen to this. Today, the top 1/10 of 1%, own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90% of the American people. Got that? 1/10 of 1% versus 90%. Today, one family, the Walton family that owns Walmart, that one family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. Over the past 40 years, we have witnessed an enormous transfer of wealth. You know, our friends on the right say, distribution of wealth, it's a communist idea, it's a terrible idea. In fact, we have seen over the last 40 years a massive redistribution of wealth in this country. The only problem is it has gone in the wrong direction. All right, here's another boring statistic, but it's important. Between 1985 and 2013, the bottom 90% lost almost $11 trillion in wealth that it otherwise would have had if the distribution of wealth had remained at the same level as it was in 1985. Bottom 90% lost almost $11 trillion, $10.8 trillion. Meanwhile, the top 1/10 of 1% experienced an $8 trillion increase in wealth as the distribution of wealth became increasingly unequal. So what you've seen is a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class, not even to the top 1%, but to the top 1/10 of 1%. And we just discovered this fact, and I was just using it on the floor of the Senate the other day. Just listen to this one, just to show you. I mean, it's just almost hard to imagine how grotesque this situation is. Between 2013 and 2015, in a 2-year period, the wealthiest 14 people in America, I'm not talking about 14%, 14 people, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, the Koch brothers and others, 14 people saw a $157 billion increase in their wealth in 2 years. That increase in wealth is more wealth than is owned by the bottom 40% of the American people, what these guys made in a 2-year period. That's where we're at. In terms of income, income is what we make in a given year as opposed to wealth, which is what we accumulate in our lifetime. The latest information that we have is that since the Wall Street crash of 2008, 99% of all new income is going to the top 1%. During that period, the top 1% earned more income than the bottom 50%. In other words, while millions and millions of Americans have seen a decline in their family income, while there has been a significant increase in senior poverty, and we have elderly people throughout this country, and it's unbelievable. You know, I'm on a committee that deals with this stuff. You've got senior citizens out there whose sole income is Social Security. It may be $10,000 a year, $12,000 a year. These are people who are literally making the choice about whether they eat properly, whether they heat their homes, whether they buy the drugs that they need. While all of that is going on for seniors, 99% of all new income is going to the top 1%. Last year, the top 25 hedge fund managers made more than $24 billion. Enough to pay the full salaries of more than 425,000 public school teachers. Today, corporate profits are at an all-time high, and CEOs earn about 270 times more than their average employees. And on it goes. In terms of taxation, today corporate America is paying about 11% of our federal revenues. In 1952, they paid over 30%. In any given year, you have major corporations like General Electric, Verizon, paying zero in federal income tax because of all the loopholes they benefit from. Every single year, we are losing at least $100 billion because corporate America and the wealthy stash their profits in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and other tax havens in order to avoid paying taxes in America. Now, that is just a very broad overview of what's going on in the American economy. Bottom line is middle class is shrinking. We have an incredible number of people in poverty. We have high unemployment. And while all of that is going on, there is a grotesque level of income and wealth inequality. Almost all new income is going to the people who need it the least. Now, what do we have to do from a public policy point of view and from a political point of view? What is our job now? Well, one of our critical jobs right now is to come up with a progressive agenda that makes sense to the American people because it addresses the real issues facing the American people. And I think one of the reasons that so many people are disillusioned or disgusted with the political process is they don't hear political leaders talking about the real issues facing their lives. All right? So what do we got to do? Let me just very briefly give you an overview of what I think a progressive agenda looks like. For a start, every poll that I have seen, when they ask the American people, they say, well, what is the thing that you're most concerned about? What people always say is jobs and the economy. Always. Whether you're a Republican, whether you're an independent, whether you're a Democrat, that is the issue. So what do we need to do? We need a federal jobs program to create millions of good-paying jobs. It may seem simple, it may seem obvious, but that is exactly what we have to do. How do you do it? Well, this is how you do it. As everybody here knows, our infrastructure in this country is crumbling. That is our roads, our bridges, our rail, our water system, wastewater plants, levees, dams, you name it. The American Society of Civil Engineers tells us we need to spend some $3.6 trillion to rebuild our infrastructure. I've introduced legislation that would, over a 5-year period, spend $1 trillion to rebuild our infrastructure. And when you do that, you create and save 13 million decent-paying jobs. Further, if the media doesn't talk about trade, we will. Our current trade policy has been a disaster. We have got to strongly oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Further, if we're going to rebuild the working class of this country, we need a strong trade union movement, and we've got to make it easier for workers to be able to join the union movement. But it's not just jobs, it's wages. Today, millions of Americans are working for starvation wages. The current federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour is a starvation wage. We have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. There is legislation on the floor which has no Republican support, going to $10.10 an hour. I think that's a good start, but over the next number of years we should get to $15 an hour. And the goal has got to be that if somebody works 40 hours a week in this country, that person is not living in poverty. We have got to also deal with pay equity. It is not acceptable that women make 78 cents on the dollar compared to men. And there's another issue. There's another very important issue out there that not a whole lot of people know about. And that is what I call the overtime scandal. And what this is about is as a result of antiquated Fair Labor Standards law and rules, you have millions of people in this country making $25,000, $28,000 who are quote-unquote supervisors. And when they're a supervisor, they're not eligible for time and a half. We have put as much pressure as we can on the Obama administration, and I believe that within the next month or two they are going to do the right thing and raise that threshold way higher so that millions of Americans will finally be able to get time and a half when they deserve it. I mentioned a moment ago the absurd tax laws that currently exist, and those have got to change. We need progressive taxation in America, and the billionaires are going to have to start paying their fair share of taxes. Warren Buffett, as you may know, has been very honest about this. This guy's worth many billions of dollars, and he says, it's a little bit absurd that a multi-billionaire's effective tax rate is lower than my secretary's. And you got hedge fund millionaires whose effective tax rate is lower than truck drivers and nurses. So we have got to welcome the billionaire class back into the United States of America, and they're going to have to start paying their fair share of taxes. It is hard or impossible to determine, what is the most, sometimes the media says, well, what's the most important issue? I don't know it. All of these issues are enormously important. But I suppose at the very top of the list might be an issue upon whose resolution will depend upon whether our planet survives, and that is climate change. It goes without saying, somebody with my politics has very strong disagreements with many of my Republican colleagues and many of my Democratic colleagues. But I do want to tell you very seriously that it is a true national or international embarrassment that we have the dominant political party in the United States Congress who are rejecting science, are ignoring what the overwhelming majority of scientists are telling us. And that is that climate change is real. Climate change is caused by human activity. Climate change is already causing devastating problems. I guess I've heard about little drought you have down here. Not to mention the problems all over this world. And it is only going to get worse. What they are telling us that if we do not get our act together by the end of this century, the planet's temperature may rise between 5 and 10 degrees. And you can only begin to imagine the consequence of that. The United States of America must lead the world in reversing climate change. And you know what? We know what to do. We know what energy efficiency is about. We know what weatherization is about. In Vermont, we have put a lot of money into weatherizing older homes. Fuel costs have gone down by 50%. Carbon emissions have gone down by 50%. We should be doing that all over this country. There is unbelievable potential, and it's only going to grow for solar, wind, for geothermal. We've got to invest and build those technologies and move away from fossil fuel as quickly as we can. I mentioned a moment ago that we are the only major country on earth that says that if you don't have any health insurance and you get sick, you're going to go bankrupt or you may die because you can't get to a doctor. We lose thousands of people every single year. And I've talked to doctors who tell me the same thing. People walk into their offices and they're really sick. And the doctor said, why didn't you come in here 6 months ago? And they said, I don't have any health insurance. I was embarrassed. We lose thousands of people a year because by the time they go to the doctor, it is too late. Healthcare must be a right of all people. The most effective way to do it is a single-payer Medicare for all system. Now, I've discussed what is going on for so many working families, the economic struggles that they are engaged in every single day, and what's going on for low-income kids in this country, people who are sleeping out on the streets. And I just spent the last week on the floor of the Senate dealing with the Republican budget. And, it is really hard and I mean this very seriously, almost to describe it or to understand where they're coming from. It is that everything that should be done, they don't do, and everything that we should not be doing, they do. This is really, if you try to think of the stupidest things that we should be doing, hey, it's in the budget. And if you try to think of what we should be doing to address America's needs, nowhere to be seen. Just give you an example. I mentioned before, we got 35 million Americans, less than we used to, because the Affordable Care Act has provided insurance for 16 million. Their idea is to terminate the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid, $440 billion of Medicaid, 27 million people thrown off of health insurance. At a time when young people are struggling to be able to afford to go to college, their solution, cut $90 billion over a 10-year period in mandatory Pell Grant funds. At a time when people in California and Vermont, working people, are flooding to emergency food shelves because their low wages don't allow them to feed their families, their solution is to make massive cuts in food stamps and nutrition programs for the elderly, working families, and children. But they did manage, and just I want you to deal with this hypocrisy. The reason for all of these horrendous cuts, $5 trillion over a 10-year period, is we just have a very high deficit, which, by the way, has been cut by 2/3 since Obama's been president. But we have a very high deficit, and we have just a terrible national debt, and that's what we've got to do. And yet in the midst of all of that rhetoric, what they managed to do is add $38 billion more for the military, unpaid for. Unpaid for. So you cut food programs for hungry kids because of the deficit, but you add $38 billion to the military, and you don't have to worry about how you pay for it. And also, of course, in the House Republican budget, it goes without saying that despite the massive level of income and wealth inequality, we need more tax breaks for the rich and large corporations. Now, I want to tell you what I think has been happening in the last 30 or 40 years in this country. And I want to say that because it should, I think, inform us about where we have got to go. The most important political development in the last 30 or 40 years has been the extreme movement to the right of the Republican Party. I know this is hard to believe, but Dwight David Eisenhower was a Republican. This is a guy who was proud of having raised the minimum wage, proud of having built the largest infrastructure program up to his point, which was the interstate highway system. Okay? The man who told us to beware of the military-industrial complex was a Republican. Dwight David Eisenhower would not be allowed into the room of a Republican Party meeting today. Now, this is what's been going on. I want to tell you something that doesn't get a lot of discussion. Media doesn't talk about it. Back in 1980, David Koch, one of the Koch brothers, ran for vice president of the United States on the Libertarian Party. And he got, 1% of the vote, and he paid for the campaign and all that. But here's what's important. I want to read to you some of the ideas, some of the, literally word for word, some of the planks of that party's platform. And I want you, this was back in 1980. And in 1980, the ideas that I'm going to read to you were thought to be crazy and fringe ideas. The political crisis of our time is the ideas that 30, 40 years ago were thought to be crazy are now literally mainstream Republican ideas. Okay? Let me read them. This is exact quote, word for word. We urge the repeal of federal campaign finance laws and the immediate abolition of the despotic Federal Election Commission. Now, what does that mean in English? What it means is the billionaire class understands that the way for them to succeed is to be able to buy elections. And when you have limitations on how much money they can spend, they see this as a very, very bad thing. Citizens United has been a disaster because it's opened the floodgates for billionaires to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on independent expenditures. What the Koch brothers said back in 1980 and what the leadership of the Republican Party is saying today, Citizens United did not go far enough. What they now want is to eliminate all restrictions so that the Koch brothers would not have to put independent expenditures on TV. They could give the money directly to the candidates of their choice. Now, what does that mean in English? This is what it means in English. It means that if they get their way, the day will come when there will be a meeting of right-wing politicians in a room like this. And the Koch brothers will say, you want to run for senator from Colorado? Here is your check from me to you for $150 million. There is your campaign manager that we pay for. There's your speechwriter. There's your media advisor. No ifs, buts, and maybes. You now work for me. You are my employee, and I am going to get you elected to be senator or governor or member of the House. That is what they want, and that is the direction this country is going. Number two, I mentioned to you before about the massive cuts in Medicare, terrible cuts in Medicaid. In 1980, Koch brothers said, we favor the abolition of Medicare and Medicaid programs. They weren't talking about cuts. They were talking about eliminating those programs entirely. 1980, quote, we favor the repeal. Listen to this. We favor the repeal of the fraudulent, virtually bankrupt, and increasingly oppressive Social Security system. They don't want to cut Social Security. They want to eliminate Social Security. We oppose all personal and corporate income taxation, including capital gains taxes. Right now, many of us are fighting to raise the minimum wage. This is their view. We support repeal of all law which impede the ability of any person to find employment, such as minimum wage laws. And more members, Republican members of Congress, believe that. They say, raise the minimum wage, you're crazy. We got to get rid of the concept of the minimum wage. So in a high unemployment area, if you are desperate enough and I can hire you for $3 an hour, that is exactly what they want. We support, they said, this is back in 1980, and watch what goes on every day on the floor of the Senate. We support the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency. I own a factory. I want the freedom to be able to throw my garbage in the lakes and the rivers and pollute the air and poison the kids. That's freedom. Lastly, and maybe most significantly, because it wraps it all up, quote, we oppose all government welfare, relief projects, and aid to the poor programs. All these government programs are privacy invading, paternalistic, demeaning, and inefficient. The proper source of help for such persons is the voluntary efforts of private groups and individuals. Do you know what that means in English? That means the end of every major piece of legislation passed since the 1930s to protect workers, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. All gone. Social Security, gone. Medicare, gone. Medicaid, gone. Head Start, gone. Environmental Protection Agency, gone. Now, obviously, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every Republican agrees with everything in this platform. But if you watch the thrust of what's been going on, you watch what goes on in the floor today of the Senate, these ideas, many of these ideas, are mainstream ideas. They haven't gotten to where they want to go. But their vision, the Koch brothers' vision, increasingly absorbed by mainstream Republicans in the Congress, is to move us back to the 1920s, when elderly people had no Medicare, no Social Security, when workers had no rights, when workers couldn't join unions. That is their vision for America. Don't kid yourself. This is not a question of whether we put more into education or less. This is a radical restructuring of American government. And now with Citizens United, and maybe worse to come, they have that ability to buy the United States Congress. Now let me conclude, now that I've gotten you all thoroughly depressed. Let me end. So my wife always reminds me that I have to hand out tranquilizers or anti-suicide packs. So she said I got to have a happy ending to these things. So, all right, so here's the happy ending, which is a true ending, and it is really true. Look, I've laid out the facts, and the facts are depressing. Can't run away from that reality. But it's not a hopeless situation, and I want to tell you why. At the end of the day, yes, they have all the money. Yes, they own the media. Yes, they own the economy. Yeah, it's pretty depressing. But here's the point. If we are strong and smart, they won't own us. And let me just give you an example. And I want to give you an example. The world changes. And Marianne was mentioning, and I guess Tom earlier was talking about, periods go through our history and ups and downs. But let's just talk about recent history. I mentioned earlier the enormous progress, and I don't want to overstate it. Racism, as we all know, remains a very serious problem in this country. But anyone who does not believe that we have come a long way in the last 30, 40 years is mistaken. No question about it. Let's talk about the struggle of women. 30, 40 years ago, there were 1, 2, 3 women in the United States Senate. Today, there are 20, and within a few years, half the Senate, half the House will be women. And again, it seemed, for the younger people especially, it seemed strange. Well, when I was growing up, weren't a whole lot of women in medical school or in law school. Now, if I'm not mistaken, more than half of the people in law school, medical school are women. It was a big deal back in the 1980s when I was mayor of Burlington. We made a radical decision. We had a woman appointed to the Burlington Police Department. You're laughing, all right? But here's the point. You should laugh. Because today, if you go to, most police departments, 20, 30, 40% of the department are women. We have women generals in the military, women in combat, all that. The world has changed in terms of gender equality. Do we still have a long way to go? Of course we do. But we have made enormous progress because of women standing up and saying we are not going to be second-class citizens. And change has come about. Change has come. I'll give you another example. 40 or 50 years ago, when a family had a child with a serious disability, it was considered to be somehow of a shame, an embarrassment to the family. And as often as not, those disabled kids were put away in some institution. Families didn't even acknowledge the reality of the child. And as a result of the struggle of a whole lot of people and good people in the Senate, my friend Tom Harkin, among others, the American Disabilities Act, right now, all over this country, in Vermont and California, you have kids with serious disabilities who are in our classrooms, who are loved and protected by the other kids. They are accepted as full human beings, part of our community. That did not happen overnight. That happened because people say, you know what, so what, somebody has a disability. That little boy or little girl is a human being, and we're going to treat that kid with all the respect he or she deserves. Didn't happen overnight. It happened because of struggle. And the last point that I want to make, and maybe it's the most dramatic of all, and that is if we were sitting in this room 15 years ago, I'm not talking about 50 years ago, I'm not talking about 30 years ago, 15 years ago, and somebody said, I think that there will be conservative states in America that will be passing legislation for gay marriage. People would have told you you are really smoking something that you should not be smoking, which is a whole other issue also. But nobody would have believed. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, my Republican colleagues got elected based on homophobia, attacks. And they don't do it anymore. You know why? Because all over this country, young people are saying, gay marriage, what's the issue? I remember, it was very funny. I go to schools, a lot of the high schools in Vermont. I go to the conservative parts of the state. And I always ask the kids, I say, well, what do you think about abortion? What do you think about gay rights? And the expression that I got from the young kids is, we don't even know what the hell you're talking about. What's the big deal? And that is what the revolution is about. That it's not a big deal. Okay? Now, I say all of that to point out that change does happen, and we've made in this country some enormously positive changes in recent years that have given a lot of dignity to people who did not have it. But where we are right now is in a major, major struggle over economic rights. And on that struggle, we are losing. And we're going to have to be very, very smart and figure out how we win. How do we make sure that working class people do not vote against their own best interest, get hung up on a dozen different issues? How do we bring people together? My Republican colleagues' function in life is to divide people up. Our job is to bring people together. And that's what... Thank you. Be that as it may. Let me conclude on this note, and this is absolutely serious, is that no president, not a Bernie Sanders, not Elizabeth Warren, not anybody, no president can accomplish the goals that we've talked about tonight unless there is a activated grassroots movement of millions of people. So let me say this. I happen, as some of you may know, Barack Obama and I have some serious disagreements. I was on the floor for 8.5 hours in opposition to his tax ideas a few years ago. But I think in a lot of respects he's a very, very smart guy and a very decent guy, and he's done a lot of good things under tremendous pressure and obstructionism. But here's the mistake that he made, and I've had the opportunity to tell him what I thought. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for re-election in 1936, some of you may have read this. I think it was in his acceptance speech when he accepted the nomination. He said that something like, never before in history has one person been as hated by what he called the economic royalists, we would call them the billionaire class, by the economic royalists as I am. And I welcome their hatred. In other words, to bring about change, real change in this country, we have got to acknowledge who our opponents are, and that is the billionaire class and all of their power. And no matter who is elected president, with all of the power that the lobbyists and the campaign donors have in Washington, there is no way that any president can bring around change unless millions of people are involved in the political process. Unless, I talked to some young people the other day who are great. They're fighting for substantially lower tuition in college and student debt issues. And the point that I made to them, if you want to substantially lower the cost of college education, bring 1 million of your friends to Washington, we will succeed. But that is true of the minimum wage, that's true of jobs, that's true of climate change. The powers in Washington, the power of the moneyed interest is so great, that Obama thought he could sit down and negotiate and try to work out compromises with the Republicans. Doesn't happen. The only way it happens is when people stand up and be part of that political revolution. So join me. Let's make a political revolution. Thank you very much. That was a long speech, huh? We'll get some water here. Thank you.
Okay, we're fine. Okay. All right, Senator, we have a few questions that have come in, but they're all the same kind of thing. And so I want to ask you, this is a presidential year coming up, obviously.
I've heard about that.
You've heard about it. You have stated publicly that you would consider running.
Yep.
And one of the things that you were just telling us is that none of the changes that we'd like to see happen, no matter who is president, would occur were there not a grassroots movement
Absolutely.
Involving millions of people
Yes.
for economic justice, et cetera.
Yes.
But I know from things that you have said publicly that you've also made it clear and that not only would that grassroots movement be necessary for any president to effectuate certain changes, but you have made it clear that part of your decision-making has to do with your wondering whether that kind of movement would be there to actually support your run for president. Is it fair to say that that's where you are in your decision-making?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, let me be very honest. Marianne described the situation exactly correct. Look, I'm not a typical politician. You're looking at somebody who started his political life in a third party, ran for the U.S. Senate from Vermont and got 2%, ran again the next time, got 1%. And got 4% and 6% and won the mayor's race by 10 votes after a recount. So it's not me. Here's the point. And Marianne hit the nail on the head. Look, I have an ego, but I can deal with loss. But if I run a campaign, and it is not a well-run campaign, that we don't have the grassroots support that we need all over the country, we don't raise the money that we need all over the country, and if it turns out badly, it's not just an embarrassment for me. That's the least of the issue. It is a setback for all of the ideas that we believe in. Now, I happen to believe that the ideas that we've been talking about this evening are in fact supported by a big majority of the American people. But if we don't run a good campaign, if we really don't have the support, and if, I get up there talking about a Medicare for all single-payer system and we don't do well, then people say, see, nobody in America wants national health care. And if we talk about income and wealth inequality, I'm already hearing the jokes that are out there. Who's going to support that? Yeah. So here's the point, and I mean it very seriously and very honestly. Running for president is no small thing. And if you do it, you have to do it well. I don't wake up in the morning, honest to God, with any burning desire to be president of the United States. Anyone who does has got to be crazy because it's an impossibly difficult job. But I do believe that the ideas, the issues that we've talked about tonight are the issues that have got to be dealt with in the country. All right, so the decision is in fact based on whether we can in fact put together a grassroots movement of millions of people. We don't have to raise $1 billion, but we have to raise enough money to run a credible and winning campaign. Can we do it? And I want to tell you what, I'm going to throw it back to you. And don't give me a glib answer. Run, Bernie, run, do this, do that. Yeah, in this room I will do very well. But the question is, how well will we do outside of this room? All right? And I mean that. I'm dead serious here. I give a lot of speeches and people come out. We all share more or less common beliefs here. Is that something, are the American people prepared to stand up and take on the billionaire class? Well, are you sure of that? All right, tell me why. Yes, ma'am, stand up. Tell me why. Can we get a mic for her?
I'd like to see you run whether you won or not, because these issues have to be brought up to the American people so that they hear these issues. They're not hearing them. They're not going to hear them from a Hillary Clinton. And I want people to know the truth. I mean, I haven't participated as much because I haven't been excited, but you bring the passion in my heart. And I'm retired now, and a lot of 60 generation people are probably retiring soon. We have a lot of time on our hand, and we can help you. We can help work and help people get educated.
All right, but thank you. All right, but here's the point. All right, I want to remember what you said. We'll take your name down here. We won't forget you. But this is the point. I mean, I talk. And believe me, I'm not just, waxing eloquent here. This is not a one-person show. This is a movement thing. My name may be in the paper, but the work that you're doing is absolutely as important. And that is the challenge. People are hurting. People are in pain. People do not think it's appropriate that so few have so much and so many have so little. People are disgusted that they don't have any health care for their kids, et cetera, et cetera. Can we bring those people together? Are people in this room prepared to be actively involved in that effort? Yes. All right. Okay. Hold it close to your mouth.
What we're facing, I mean, it's almost like an oligarch. It's a time for a
It
revolution.
is an oligarchy. It's not like
and
an
the
oligarchy.
only hope that we have for a real revolution, they've got the guns, they've got the money, they've got the media, they've got the power. If we're going to fight them, you are the one that can lead us. We need someone to lead us.
I have as big an ego as anybody else.
We need a leader.
I am not a modest guy, but here's the point. I don't like, I really mean this seriously. I know we all have a job to do, and it's not me being, I would be out there. But again, we don't succeed unless there is a movement. I'm not a great fan of great leaders because you got a leader today and you have a leader tomorrow take it a different direction. What we need is a movement, a democratic movement of people. That's what we need.
Let's give a round of passion. Now you can make some sound. Applause for Senator Bernie Sanders.